All right, guys. Good morning. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there with you guys today, but I'm going to go over the lecture in regards to fiscal policy, which is kind of where we wanted to go with Unit 3. Uh, in class, we would have started off with an introduction to each one of these attributes and have you guys write down what you know about each one. For the sake of time, you guys are watching a video. Here's what we're looking at. We've got two types of gaps. We have a negative output gap and a positive output gap. Looking at a negative output gap, we can see that there's three attributes. So you got your GDP is less than your full employment output. So your GDP is less than it should be. Your unemployment rate is greater than your natural rate of unemployment. And there's deflation or no inflation. We're going to usually assume deflation. Of these three attributes, what is the problem? Well, the problem with this economy is high unemployment. Yeah, we'd like this to be greater. Sure, we'd like to be at 2% inflation, but having high unemployment is the problem and a negative output gap that we'd want to solve. In a positive output gap, we have three attributes again. This time our GDP is greater than our full employment output, our unemployment rate is less than our natural rate of unemployment, and our inflation is high. Looking at these three attributes, I'm thinking, hey, our problem with this economy is we're experiencing high inflation. The purchasing power of our wages and the money in our pocket or our savings is not going to go as far. Our purchasing power has decreased. So we need to solve this problem. So we need to solve high inflation. So if I was to fix an economy in a negative output gap, I'd be looking to fix unemployment. If I was looking to fix an economy in a positive output gap, I'd be looking to fix high inflation. So that's what we're up to today. We're going to look at fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the way that the government stabilizes the economy. And this is an image as old as Mr. Owen. You're looking at a broken economy. So this is the United States economy represented as a pipe. It's burst, it's leaking, it's broken. And so it can be broken in two ways: high unemployment in a negative output gap, or high inflation in a positive output gap. So throughout this semester, we're going to be dealing with fiscal policy and monetary policy. This lecture is focusing on fiscal policy. That's what we have in Unit 3. Unit 4, we'll look at monetary policy. So fiscal policy is going to be actions by Congress to stabilize the economy. And by stabilize, I mean fix. So fix unemployment or fix high inflation. Monetary policy is going to be the same thing. It's going to be done by the Fed. No need to get into that description right now. So today we're just focusing in on fiscal policy. It's this tool chest right here that Uncle Sam brought in to fix the economy. Notice there's only two tools in this tool chest: spending and taxation. Spending and taxation right off the bat is going to lead you to think, hey, maybe if the government increases or decreases spending, that'll have an effect on aggregate demand. And taxes can also have an effect on aggregate demand. One, as a result of government spending, that'll later get passed on to consumers through our MPC, MPS, and taxes, which will also affect our aggregate demand, this time through consumer spending. So let's get right after it. Today we're going to do discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is when Congress creates a brand new bill. This bill would be designed to move aggregate demand through the two tools that Congress can manipulate: government spending, which it decides on its own, because Congress has the power of the purse strings, or taxation. Taxation would also influence aggregate demand because it changes the disposable income available to consumers, and therefore going to move consumer spending and thus aggregate demand. So an example would be in a recession, Congress could increase spending. Non-discretionary fiscal policy is something we're going to cover in the next class. So let's let this dog just sleep. So we have two types of fiscal policy. We have a contractionary fiscal policy and an expansionary fiscal policy. And the names give them away. A contractionary fiscal policy is going to be laws that reduce inflation, decrease GDP, and closes a positive output gap. It's a contractionary policy, so it's decreasing or contracting our GDP. The goal is to bring a positive output gap back to full employment output. How can we do that? Well, if you want to move AD and you want to decrease GDP, what do we know? Well, we know that if you decrease government spending, aggregate demand will go to the left. If you increase taxes, consumers will have less disposable income. So consumer spending will decrease and aggregate demand will go to the left. Both of these two tools bring aggregate demand to the left in a contractionary fiscal policy. Both of them have a goal of decreasing GDP. As GDP decreases, it's going to lower the price level. It's going to fix our inflationary problem. You could also do both at the same time. An expansionary fiscal policy is the opposite. These are laws that reduce unemployment and increase GDP. So, as the name suggests, an expansionary fiscal policy increases GDP. I'm expanding the GDP. I'm increasing GDP. I'm doing that through a rightward shift of aggregate demand. The goal here is to close a negative output gap, to turn that negative output gap into a full employment output. How would the government do that? Well, Congress can initiate government spending. You start spending, AD moves to the right. You could also decrease taxes. You decrease taxes on a consumer, that's going to make available more disposable income, and there'll be a tendency to treat yourself. So consumer spending will increase and AD goes to the right. So an expansionary fiscal policy, the goal is to increase GDP, moving AD to the right. So expansionary, increase GDP, increase aggregate demand. They all go together. So expanding our GDP is done by expanding aggregate demand through government spending or decreasing taxes. Contractionary decreases GDP, decreases aggregate demand. They do that through decreasing government spending or increasing taxes. So if you can think contractionary, you're shrinking it and you're shrinking AD. Expansionary, you're increasing GDP, increasing AD. All right, let's just throw this puppy into practice because that's really all we got. But we can't just do one thing without explaining how it can get multiplied into the economy. So here we're looking at a sample. This is an economy representing current GDP, a YE, let me move this out of the way. A current GDP, or a YE, short-run equilibrium, where our economy is operating, is at $400 billion. Our full employment output lives underneath our long-run aggregate supply. We should be at $500 billion. So what am I looking at here? I'm looking at a negative output gap of $100 billion. Our economy is underperforming. So what type of gap is shown? Here, we're going to say that's a negative output gap. Let's just drop this over here. Let's get the camera on screen. Get that out of the way. All right, so we're going to move this puppy right here. Hopefully I stay in focus. Let's move the screen over just a smidge. That should do it. All right. No, that didn't do it. There we go. All right, so what type of gap is shown? Our first one, I'm going to say that's a negative output gap. So in my mind, now I think about what's the problem with a negative output gap. Oh boy. I've got high unemployment. So what policy is best? If I want to fix this economy, I need to expand my GDP to bring it back to full employment output. So I need an expansionary fiscal policy. What should the government do with spending? Well, I have two tools. I can mess with government spending or taxation. Here they're just asking about government spending. I'm going to say, I'm going to increase government spending. Why? Because an increase in government spending moves aggregate demand to the right. Now, how much should the government spend? Well, there's our question. Now we can go back to what we talked about a few days ago when we were looking at our total change in GDP and working with our multipliers. Let's get that just right there. That should be, and we lost focus. Drop something exciting in front of my camera, bring it back. All right, so I'm going to take this equation right here and say, hey, my total change in GDP is going to be $100 billion. How do I know that? Well, if I look over here, I'm currently operating at 400 billion when I should be at 500 billion. So that's what I need to close. That's the total change I need to address. My spending multiplier I can solve because they gave us an MPC. My spending multiplier is 1 divided by MPS, or in this case, 1 divided by 0.1, because MPC and MPS have to add up to 1. So if I spend 0.9, that means I'm saving 0.1 of every dollar that I receive. So my spending multiplier in this case is going to be 10. Now I can use that 10 and bring it up here to my total change in GDP equation we talked about a few days ago. My spending multiplier is 10. My total change in GDP is $100 billion. So how much am I going to change in initial spending? Well, I'm going to have to increase spending by $10 billion. I'm just solving for the initial spending. So in this case, to address how much did the government change its spending by, I'm going to say it's going to have to increase its spending by $10 billion. Here's another example. This time we're looking at a MPC of 0.8, and we have another scenario. This time it says Congress uses discretionary fiscal policy to manipulate the following economy. All right, let's get some questions up here. So what type of gap is created? Let's drop us out of full screen. I'm going to be operating right here. When I drop it out of full screen, that little friend's going to show up. Ignore him. We're in a negative output gap right here. Okie dokie. So new fresh page. Whoop, whoop. So in this economy, what type of gap am I showing? Again, I'm starting right here at my price level at equilibrium and this value in real GDP. So with number one, I'm going to say that I'm operating in a negative output again. My big problem is going to be high unemployment. Oh, I spelled unemployment wrong. Too late to turn back now. Number two, what do I need? Well, I need my economy to grow. I'm underperforming by 500 billion. So in this case, I need to expand my economy. I need an expansionary fiscal policy. I need to get AD to move to AD1. In this case, I labeled it AD2. So what do I need? Expansionary. Expansionary fiscal policy. So what are my two options? Well, now we're going a little further. I'm going to need to increase government spending or cut taxes. And the final question is, what is the least amount of initial government spending to close the gap? So how much do we need to spend to fix this negative output gap? All right, so I bring down my equation. What's my total change in GDP I need to address? 500 billion. I'm going to have to solve for a spending multiplier because we're talking about spending here. So my spending multiplier is going to be 1 over MPS. Given an MPC of 0.8, my MPS would be 0.2. So in this case, my simple spending multiplier will be 5. So I can throw that puppy right here. Now I'm solving for how much do I have to increase my spending by. In this case, I'm going to have to increase spending by $100 billion to correct this gap. So now, if I was operating here and Congress increased government spending by $100 billion, it would get multiplied out in the economy and move us back to full employment output. We've corrected our high unemployment issue. All right, we have another problem. This time our MPC is 0.5, and we need to work this problem out. I'm going to drop this puppy out of here. Disregard the second curve. Again, we're operating right here. My animation would be for the classroom, so ignore him. We're operating at price level at equilibrium and $100 billion of real GDP. Let's flip our page. In this case, What type of gap is shown? All right, this time it's a positive output gap. What is the problem with a positive output gap? We have high inflation. Number two, what type of policy do I need to enact? Contractionary or expansionary fiscal policy? This time I want to decrease my GDP. I want to make it smaller. I want to contract it. I want to bring AD to the right. I want to make it smaller. I want to contract it. So I want a contractionary fiscal policy. What are my two options this time? Well, this time my option would be to decrease government spending or increase taxes. Both of those would bring aggregate demand to the left. How much spending is needed to close the gap? All right, well, there's our big question. This time, let's address what is our gap. We're currently operating at $100 billion. Our real GDP is 100 when it should be 80. So now I have a positive output gap of $20 billion that I'm going to need to address. I'm going to need to solve for my spending multiplier. Given an MPC of 0.5, my MPS would also be 0.5. So in this case, my multiplier is going to be 2. So let's plug it in. With a spending multiplier of 2, how much spending is going to need to be cut? Because this time it's negative. So I'm going to need to decrease spending by $10 billion. Put some billions on there. So you could phrase it in two ways. You could say it would be negative $10 billion in government spending, or you could say it'd be a cut in spending of $10 billion. Sound good? All right. We have another scenario here. Congress uses discretionary fiscal policy to manipulate the falling economy. Now we're looking at a full employment output of $100 billion and a short-run equilibrium or a current GDP of $80 billion. So I've got a gap. Again, it's a $20 billion gap. So let's solve this puppy out. This time, skipped over some steps. Didn't ask about what gap we're in because at this point we should be pretty comfortable with the fact that we're operating right here. Our GDP is less than our full employment output, so we know that we're operating in a negative output gap. We know that we have high unemployment. We know we're going to have to enact an expansionary fiscal policy. We'll know that our tools are going to be to increase government spending and cut taxes. So now we can start getting after the questions. So number one asks us, what options does the government have? Well, we addressed it right there. So question number one was we can increase government spending or we can cut taxes. But by how much? Well, no problem. We've done it a couple times now. We know that our gap, or the total change in GDP that we need to address, is $20 billion. Now we need to solve for our spending multiplier. So, well, I'm addressing question number two, I'm sorry. How much should government spending increase by to close the gap? Good work, Mr. Owen. Well, in this case, we have an MPC of 0.8, so I know that my MPS is 0.2. If my MPS is 0.2, my spending multiplier is going to be 5. So in this case, I'm going to put my spending multiplier right here. What's going to be my initial change in spending? That's going to have to be $4 billion. So to address question number 2, $4 billion. But we have a second part. How much should taxes be closed by to fix the gap? Well, now they're talking about taxes. With taxes, I'm going to have to use my tax multiplier. I didn't make a sheet for it, but we can just roll with it. We always know it's going to be one less than my spending multiplier, but my simple tax/transfer multiplier is going to be my MPC over my MPS. Clear that out so we don't get messy. In this case, they said that our MPC is 0.8, which means my MPS is 0.2. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4. Again, if the decimals freak you out, just ignore them. 8 divided by 2 is 4. I can always check my work and say, hey, was the tax multiplier less than the spending multiplier by 1? It was, so I'm good. So now I can just re-tackle the problem, but use our spending multiplier. Correction, sorry, our tax multiplier. So my total change in GDP is still the same. I'm still looking at this gap right here. My total change I need to address is 20 billion. But this time, I'm working with my tax multiplier. So in this case, my tax multiplier is 4. The multiplier is smaller, so there's going to have to be a larger change in tax feds. In this case, I'd say, all right, how much do taxes need to be cut by? Taxes need to be cut by $5 billion. So in this case, my answer is $5 billion. So we approach it from two ways, spending and taxes on that one. Okay, so that is how we do it, the two tools and methods behind it, looking at the two equations. Now let's talk about some problems with fiscal policy. So the first problem we should address, not indicated here, is that fixing a positive output gap, fixing high inflation in the economy is going to be particularly difficult. I should probably put this here. Why would fixing an inflationary or positive output gap be difficult for Congress to pass? Well, if I'm operating in a positive output gap, let's indicate it here, with our price level, with GDP, AS, AD, long run aggregate supply, and we have our YE, a YF, and a price level. Well, here I'm in a positive output gap. I know my problem is high inflation. So the people in my economy are struggling because their salaries, their savings, their wealth doesn't go as far. They can't buy as many goods and services because inflation has eaten up the purchasing power. The tools that government can use to fight this would be to decrease government spending or to increase taxes. This would be a recipe for disaster for anybody to suggest something like this in Congress, because people are suffering because their wealth doesn't go as far. Your $10 doesn't buy as many products as it did before the inflation. Now, if you fight this by increasing taxes, now people have to pay more to the government. It decreases their disposable income, and it's going to make life even harder. Proposing this would really upset your constituents. Cutting government spending, same thing. You can imagine how that's going to play out in a slogan, right? Hey, Jeff Owen, running for Congress. Hey, I know everyday struggle. We're dealing with high inflation. We're not getting as much out of our money as we want, but I'm here to fix that. I'm here to increase your taxes, cut the services available to you, to rein in that inflation, and bring us all back together. It's going to hurt, but the economy comes first. Vote Owen, 2024. You can imagine that's not going to do so well. So right off the bat, we can say that a positive output gap is going to have a really tough time being solved by Congress, because no one's going to want to increase taxes on people who are already suffering from high inflation. Another type of problem that we have with fiscal policy is that it takes a long time to put this into effect. It's going to have three major time lags associated with it. The first one is recognition lag. So economists have to identify that, hey, we are experiencing a problem. high unemployment or high inflation. Then they need to take that information, they need to present it to the people that pass these laws. They need to take it to Congress. Next, we're going to have our administrative lag. To pass that law, it's going to have to get through both houses, and it's going to have to be voted on by the president. So this is going to take a long time. And finally, operational lag. It's going to take a long time to get that money into the economy. So maybe a good example of government spending is that trolley going into UCSD. That took about, I want to say, 5 years to build that thing. Well, if you are choosing to build that trolley as a form of government spending to increase aggregate demand, that's going to take 5 years to implement all of that spending. You pay your workers every 2 weeks. You buy the concrete as needed, because you can't buy it in bulk and sit it by the side of the 5 freeway, or we'd have no 5 freeway. You buy the steel and all the other components as needed, and then put them in. So it's 5 years to get that money into the economy, and it can take even longer for that income that was the salary of the workers to get spent out in the economy to hit the full effect of the multiplier. So this is a really long process. Hey, there's a video. We're going to skip it. If you want to watch it, go for it. It's on YouTube, Fiscal Policy by Crash Course Econ. Good stuff. Let's tackle a couple practice problems. A lot of these practice problems I use to just go with the old graph approach, draw it out, and it should solve our problem. So an appropriate fiscal policy to combat a recession would be to increase which of the following? I'm going to pause it. Well, you guys can pause it right here and ponder. Okay, hopefully you unpaused. So I have to read this and figure out what kind of gap am I talking about. They're saying recession, and a recession is 6 months of declining GDP. So I'm going to make the assumption here that our GDP is less than our full employment output because we've had 6 months of declining GDP. So if I have a negative output gap, I have 2 tools that I can use to solve it. I can increase government spending or cut taxes. They asked, which one of these needs to be increased to fix the problem? You increase interest rates, businesses would buy less capital stock. That's out. So AD would go to the left. Money supply is something we're going to talk about in monetary policy. So it does not address fiscal policy. We'll come back to that. If you increase taxes, that's going to be a contractionary fiscal policy. That one's out because we're in a negative output gap as indicated by the recession. And a sale of government bonds, we're going to have to get to that in Unit 4. That's definitely not one of our tools of fiscal policy. So I'm going to go with B. We're going to need to increase government spending to move AD to the right to combat a recession, to combat a negative output gap. Okay, our next one doesn't necessarily relate to fiscal policy, but it's talking about taxes. So we can throw this in there as a good practice anyway. An increase in personal income taxes would most likely cause aggregate demand and aggregate supply to change in which of the following ways? We're talking about income tax, so it'll have no effect on aggregate supply. So right off the bat, I like option C, and I like option E. So now I have to think, okay, what effect is it going to have on aggregate demand? Is it going to decrease it, or increase it? If you increase my personal income taxes, that's going to take away my disposable income. I'm going to pay more money to the government, and I'll have less disposable income available to buy goods and services. So consumer spending would fall, and aggregate demand would decrease. All right, number 11. Which of the following combinations of changes in government spending and taxation is necessarily expansionary? This word necessarily isn't necessary. Let's just drop that out of there and just make this more palatable. Which of the following combinations of government spending and taxes is expansionary? Which one is going to make GDP grow, make aggregate demand go to the right? So pause it and ponder. Okay, if we went back to our notes, we'd say, okay, what is an expansionary fiscal policy? I'd want to increase government spending, so A or B work, and I want to decrease taxes. So now I'm thinking B. Okay, number 21, with an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, an increase in government expenditures will most likely, all right, so let's see. What do we have here? I'm going to pause it and ponder it. All right, hopefully you've unpaused by now. So a lot of distractors here. An upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Well, it's always upward sloping, so again, distracting. So we're just going to assume an increase in government spending would do what? We know that's an expansionary fiscal policy, and that's going to increase GDP. So we're going with C. If we need a little illustration of that one, get the exciting movie out of the screen, bring that right here. Price level, GDP. They said upward sloping, but the short run is always upward sloping. Price level at equilibrium and GDP. So if we were to increase government spending, that's going to affect aggregate demand. Why? Because G is a component. It's part of our expansionary. I would draw a new AD curve on here. I'd be experiencing inflation, and my GDP would increase. So A is out the window because we have an increase in price level. Reduce the level of nominal GDP. Nope, our real GDP is going up. So there's our right answer, C. A shift in aggregate supply. No, this is government spending. Anytime you say spending or expenditure, that implies aggregate demand. And a shift in aggregate demand and the long-run aggregate supply, well, that's not going to be the case. We'll talk about shifts of long-run aggregate supply in Unit 5. C is our magic answer. All right, this might be the last one. Probably should have previewed a little bit better. Which of the following are most likely short-run effects of an increase in government expenditures? This is a good problem. I mean, I'm highlighting this right now because, oh my goodness, I feel like I've seen this before. Maybe on a unit exam. I'm going to pause you right there, or pause me right here. And let's take a look. Okay, if there is an increase in government expenditures, then AD is going to go to the right. When AD goes to the right, we know our GDP is going to increase. We know inflation is going to increase, but our unemployment rate is going to need to decrease. Uh-oh, why? Let's get that answer on here, and let's refer back to those notes we just did. Well, I'll just redraw it again. All right, so they didn't say the state of our economy, but let's just put the long run in here as a frame of reference. Price level, our GDP, AS, AD, price level at equilibrium, YF. So they said an increase in government spending. Well, that's going to bring aggregate demand to the right. Price level goes up, and our GDP goes up. So I know right off the bat, I can see on this graph, my inflation rate increases. It's right here. I can see that my real GDP increases. That's right here. But what about that unemployment rate? Well, the unemployment rate is going to decrease because as we progress through GDP, our unemployment rate declines. Oh, sorry about that. My T got cut off. Why? Well, what do we know about a negative output gap? If I'm in a, well, that was more like a positive. Let's try that again. Let's use a bigger piece of paper. More room. So if I have a negative output gap, we know that I have high unemployment. It's going to be greater than the natural rate. So I'm going to say 8%. If I'm at full employment output, I'm at my natural rate of unemployment. So 4 to 6%. And if I'm at a positive output gap, I have less than my natural rate of unemployment. So maybe 2%. So 8, we'll call that 5 and 2. My GDP was here, my GDP is at full employment, and now my GDP is over here. As my GDP increases, my unemployment rate declines. If I went deeper into a negative output gap, my unemployment rate would go up. If I went further into a positive output gap, my unemployment rate would decline. The more we're producing in GDP, the less our unemployment rate. Why? Because there's 3 resources in production. We've got land, we have labor, and we have capital. In the short run, if government spending increases and that money starts getting multiplied out in the economy, it's not going to have any effect on the amount of land under production in the short run. Or we're probably not going to be able to get more land under cultivation in the short run. Our animals are probably not going to start having babies left and right, and you get it. Capital, factories take a really long time to build. So in the short run, an increase in government expenditures is not going to give us a lot more capital. But if our economy starts heating up, our labor can be easily changed. If you weren't working, if you're unemployed, hey, maybe now you're going to get that job you want. So this one is easily shifted. If there's a change in GDP, land and capital are going to be slow to respond, but you can get more people working and producing more. So as we produce more in GDP, our unemployment goes down. Hopefully that explains it. Also have that in the notes for you from lecture 11. Boom, we did it. All right, so this is where we're going to pick up when we come back. So you guys, thank you so much, and I hope you guys have a great day.